Welcome to Rehash.
Hey everybody, welcome to Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and today we're speaking with Kabuki, a DJ and producer who has been in the electronic music scene since the mid-90s and has experience working with major labels, with starting his own label, with streaming, and most recently with experimenting in Web3. In this episode, we'll be talking about how the music landscape has changed over the last 3 decades and some of the new opportunities that Web3 might enable for artists and creators. Kabuki was nominated by Karsten and voted onto the podcast by Christina Beltramini and Karsten. Before we dive into our conversation, here's a quick word from the Web3 projects that helped make this season possible.
Social media wasn't designed for ads and algorithms. It was made for people. And at Lens Protocol, we're putting people back in control. We're not looking for users' data. We're here to build a community of collaborators, builders, artists, and dreamers ready to unlock a new world of social media. This isn't just an app. It's a flourishing ecosystem of platforms and experiences owned and operated by the developers and creators who are bringing it to life. In the Lensverse, you don't just own your content, you own everything. Your data, your connections, the value you bring to the table, it all stays in your possession, exactly where it should be. As a creator, the Lens ecosystem offers a new set of tools for connecting with your audience. Your data is truly portable and belongs to you. Post once and distribute everywhere in the Lensverse. You can even take your followers with you from app to app. As a developer, you can skip right past building the base layers and scaling your users by plugging your new app directly into Lens's existing infrastructure and community. So whether you create with a brush or a camera, sound waves or lines of code, it's time you got your due. Come create the future of social media with us on Lens Protocol. Lens is the last social media handle you'll ever need.
Have you seen how epic Ambire Wallet is?
How epic it is?
Yeah, cue the music. Ambire is a Web3 wallet that makes crypto self-custody easy and secure for everyone. Instead of relying on clunky seed phrases, you can create an account with the hardware wallet or username and password, secure it with two-factor authentication, and regain access with Ambire's cloud recovery. Need to pay out some contributors or execute a bunch of trades? No problem, Chief. Queue up as many transactions as you want, and when you're ready, execute the entire batch at the same time, paying gas only once. You can even prepay for gas with stablecoins or Ambire's native wallet token, which will get you some cash back. Without ever leaving the Ambire interface, you can manage assets from over a dozen chains, safely migrate them with Ambire's built-in bridge, and seamlessly interact with dApps like Uniswap, Aave, and Snapshot, all within the same transaction. Plus, Ambire is constantly growing their dApp catalog with trusted partners and collaborating with builders who want to establish the new standard for smart contract wallets. So, pretty epic, huh?
Yeah, I already know all that though. I've had an Ambire wallet for months.
And you didn't tell me?
You never asked.
To get involved and truly own your assets, go to ambire.com.
How was your day?
Bad.
What happened?
I bought some NFTs and then they just disappeared.
Sounds like your NFT creator should have used NFT.storage.
NFT. What?
NFT.storage. Come on, I'll show you. With NFT.storage, anyone can easily upload their NFT data to a decentralized and reliable storage network, completely for free.
Wow! How does it work?
Well, instead of relying on centralized and impermanent storage solutions, NFT.storage uploads your files to IPFS and Filecoin. These are powerful peer-to-peer networks that are made for the decentralized web. Thanks to IPFS's unique storage system, you can be confident that once your files are uploaded, they'll be accessible from anywhere in the world for as long as you'd like. They're already trusted by some of the biggest names in Web3, like OpenSea, Magic Eden, and Rarible. By adding files to these networks for free, NFT.storage is helping to turn proper NFT data management into a public good. This will ensure that NFTs will remain accessible and secure in the long run, so you won't get rugged again.
Gee, so I just upload my files and NFT.storage will take care of the rest?
Now you're getting it! Go to NFT.storage today to upload some NFT data of your own, for free. And be sure to follow NFT.storage on Twitter, @NFTDOTStorage.
So without further ado, here's our guest, Kabuki. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Diana. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So before we dive into all the Web3 stuff, well, first I should just say that a lot of the information that I've gathered for this podcast and a lot of the questions I've come up with are from Karsten, who is a personal friend of yours. And you guys have quite the cool story of meeting in a record shop where he was buying some of your records. And then you reconnected once both of you were in the Web3 world years later, which is such a cool story. So I just want to give Karsten a shout out for a lot of the questions that you'll hear on this podcast, a lot of the conversation topics, background information that was all provided by Karsten. So thank you, Karsten.
Amazing.
I do want to ask, just to get started, your artist name is Kabuki, which is not your real name. And I know based on my Wikipedia search that Kabuki is a Japanese term that I believe refers to a classical form of Japanese dance drama. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct. I mean, essentially, like if you spell it out, it's 3 individual syllables that make up the term. And when I picked the name, I guess there was some kind of subconscious implication because essentially like the actors in the Kabuki theater, they can play all kinds of roles depending on which mask they wear. So it's the same person, but depending on his choice, he can also like express himself in different ways. So, that really resonated with me because I felt even very early on, I had like a variety of interests, and I'm just like a very passionate person, finding out things that fascinate me. So I always had an issue with being pigeonholed. So in that sense, I really loved that idea to have that freedom, specifically in the early days of electronic music, you would just pick a name. Nobody knew who you looked, if you were a man or a woman or a group. And so, that kind of facelessness on one hand and also that freedom on the other hand, I think that would lead me to pick the name Kabuki.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And I know you also have drawn from influences from Japanese culture in other ways as well. I think back in the late 90s, you collaborated on a track with another artist, Mainframe, that featured a sample from Ghost in the Shell, which I think is an anime series. So there's quite a few references to Japanese culture. I'm wondering like how that started and what it is about Japanese culture that really kind of pulled you in.
It's a good question. I guess it has something to do a bit with escapism. Eskapismus, we call it in German. This, where I grew up, it's like a small garrison town outside of Frankfurt, and the US military had a base there. So my earliest memories, were kind of being surrounded by American culture and having English-speaking friends. So somehow American culture was like a second nature to me. And when I first discovered Asia and specifically Japan, I felt like this was just something I had no reference points to. And I was very fascinated by, aspects of the diligence and the discipline and, mastery. I could see similarities to how I was pursuing my career as a musician and how I was studying. Because back then, you didn't have YouTube, you didn't have anything. You just really needed to search out people who knew what they were doing and then ask them for their guidance, So it resonated very much with me, the Japanese culture. So I don't know, it's maybe this mix between just being really drawn towards something and also discovering something I had no reference point to and wanting to find out more. So I immersed myself, in a lot of forms of media, music, film. Film is an important thing for me anyway, like ever since I grew up, I spent my pocket money on buying VHS tapes back in the day. Like I still have a big collection at my folks' home, which features, like movies from all over the world. Like that was my first way of understanding how other cultures work, is through watching movies and discovering these ways how people live and how different life can be. So maybe that was also something, through Japanese cinema really attracted me because it just goes by very different rules compared to, American movies or German movies, that kind of pacing, and giving things room to breathe. So I always look for inspiration. It doesn't matter if it's like going to a museum, going to a restaurant, or just looking at architecture. So I would say that's maybe why I felt so strongly drawn towards that.
Sometimes it really is the types of culture and the types of things that are so different from what we're used to that tend to draw us in the most. I can completely understand that. So you mentioned, a few references, Blast to the Past. You've got a big VHS collection. Back in the day when you first started, YouTube didn't even exist. So I kind of want to run through your music career from the past 3 decades because we've had other musical artists on the podcast before, but I don't think any that started out their career such a long time ago. So I want to start from the beginning and kind of talk about how the landscape has changed over time, and then eventually get into Web3 and how that has influenced the work that you do now and your experiences there. So starting from, I guess, the very, very beginning, what was it back in the 90s that made you decide that you want to become a professional DJ and producer?
I mean, to be fair, there were not many reference points where I could say, I want to model my career on such and such. These days it's so much easier to follow a path. But back then it was really, you have to understand, like in the 90s, indie labels were not a thing. You had the major labels, they had the infrastructure to press records, to distribute records, and to kind of do your own thing and kind of release music that is not commercially viable, so to speak. That was a real challenge. So I would say the attraction, to become a professional musician was, I had no choice. Let's put it that way. Like when I started out, I studied classical guitar in the first place. That was when I was a teenager. There was no other form of musical education. So I figured, let's get started there. And then when I was in high school, I had like a fateful encounter at a music school in Vienna. I was doing like summer semesters there, and there were hosting this European dependency of the Musicians Institute from Hollywood. So it's like one of the high profile music schools from the US, and they send some of their teachers abroad. So while I was there, I was first introduced to like modal jazz. Like I heard Chick Corea and I heard Herbie Hancock's Maiden Voyage for the first time, and that just kind of set something off in me that could not be reversed. And then I realized I don't care about this classical music. This really speaks to me. And when I first discovered hip hop, I realized, oh, hold on, they're actually sampling all my favorite jazz records, and they're kind of doing their own take on it and finding these little pockets in the record and looping them and turning that into something special. So then I realized I don't want to be a player. I don't want to be an instrumentalist at all. I just want to create, music, like maybe like somebody who's doing a collage. So then the kind of physical aspect of being like a really good performer was no longer relevant. I wanted to understand how you can actually create and record this music. And that meant in the first place, getting like a 4-track tape recorder. That was like you would take an audio cassette and then the 1/4 inch would be split into 2 for the left and the right side. But then with a 4-track, you could actually have even like smaller increments, and through this you were able to layer instruments. So I could layer like a drum machine and then play like a bass line on top and like add a sample. And that was like really, really rudimental. Like the first sample I had was like with 12 seconds sample time, but it was separated into 4 banks of 2.5 seconds. So you had to be really creative. And what you would do in this time is you would take a record that you had the breakbeat on it, for instance. You would play it back on 45 plus 8. So it was playing really fast. And then once you had like maybe 1.8 seconds in the sampler, you would pitch it down. So you would hit it at the regular speed. But it had all these crazy artifacts. Like if you listen to, early hip hop by Pete Rock or even like guys like Daft Punk, they actually utilize this. So it's a very specific sound that was created by technical limitations. So in a way, that was really like when I understood that I have to do it. It's not, I have no choice. I just have to express myself somehow to stay sane and happy and to feel like my life has a purpose. So obviously, then the next question was like, how can I share this music with others? And then at first you would maybe, copy tapes and then sell them to the other crazy people who are into the similar, in a similar situation, that they're searching out new sounds. Obviously tape was a real thing back then. That was like an easy and convenient way to mass manufacture, something more like 10 copies was usually not a thing to do yourself. So then you would get like little runs of like 50 copies and so on. It was also like financially viable. You could pay that, but to then make the step to actually manufacture a record, so fast forward to like 95 and obviously a 12-inch record, that was the format that you would buy music to play in the radio or in a club. So obviously that was the holy grail. If you would be able to press a record, then you were made in a way. So the problem was that at this time, all the infrastructure was in the hands of the major labels. There was no independent record pressing possible here in Germany. So I started to then figure out, okay, what's the landscape? Are there any kind of up and coming crews that also tried to pursue this. And I got in touch with the record label here in Frankfurt, like one of the first 3 indie record labels, you could say, that actually formed here in Germany, called Infracom. And they had the possibility to press records. So I was then commissioned to do a remix for them. And that was my very first 12-inch release. And I remember still, having this in my hand and being able to play it from the vinyl, the track that I produced, that felt like, okay, now this is real. This is no longer just a hobby now. Now we're in the major league, So that was a very interesting time because, the process of manufacturing a record is involving a lot of processes that are very labor intensive, involve like dangerous chemicals. You need huge machinery. So to understand what goes into this, to really study the process, cutting a mother, which is a metal disc sprayed on with a lacquer, and then with a special diamond needle, you can then cut grooves into this. And then after this comes the galvanic process. You send it to a specialized plant where then they turn this basically into a negative that you can then put the raw vinyl into it and then press it into the record. And I really studied the whole process to understand also how can I optimize like what I do in terms of the music production to get an exact end result or as close as possible to what are my intentions. And this was like a really fascinating time because, as I said, there was no manual. You really had to go to people, ask them. Sometimes they would not want to tell you, or you wanted to sample a specific break, and then you heard somebody play it in the club, but they actually peeled off the label from the record to not share the secrets, So it was a very interesting point in time.
Wow. Okay. So back then, once you get signed to a major label, does that mean, you've got food on the table every day for the next year? Or like, what does that mean? Are you set as an artist or do you still need to go out and find other income streams?
Yeah, it was quite interesting because for the first couple of years, I was quite living well off the indie game. So first making a name for myself, releasing on different independent labels. Back then you could easily press 2,000-3,000 copies of a 12-inch. And, then once the royalties came in, there was always like a steady income stream. And then through that kind of fame, so to speak, or by making myself a name on the underground circuit, I was actually able to knock on the door of a major label back in the day. So that was EMI was one deal, and then also had a deal with Sony. So I could actually speak to the A&R, pitch them an idea, and then, as you said, there was like a big check with a lot of zeros that I could then also really say, okay, I'm going to focus now for a while just on writing the music for this. I could travel, we went to New York, we went to London, we hooked up with different people for the album. You mentioned the track that contains the Ghost in the Shell sample. We could clear samples, that's also one thing. Back then also publishing was a very important source of income. I had a publisher who was kind of representing my performance rights and my mechanical rights, and they would just collect the money coming from airplay or through the manufacturing process. And that was also like a healthy check I would get, like what they call a rolling advance. They would give me an advance. The money would just come in. They said, hey, we already flush again. You want to get another advance? So it was like a kind of support system you found yourself in that was quite comfortable for a while. And there was also like a danger because once, it just needs for like a tiny change for everything to come tumbling down. And then you have to also be flexible enough to figure out, okay, this is no longer like a viable option. What can I do next? So I guess this is something like a common thread that goes through these 3 decades in music, that whatever is happening now, it's going to be unraveled at some point and something new will come. And there's no point in kind of saying like, I want it to stay that way, because that's not how life works. Life always moves forward, and you have to understand, when it's time to say goodbye and close the door behind you, and then a new door will appear and you will have to adapt to the new times.
Yeah, and I think that's a lot easier said than done, right? Because there's so many pieces of that. There's the first piece is, first of all, picking up on what the newest trends are, because you don't want to be catching up on trends after we're kind of already past it and on to the next thing. So that's the first thing. And then you also have to have this willingness to let go of this new thing. You're like, okay, see, I spot this new trend. I finally figure out how to make it work for me. It's working super well. And then now all of a sudden we've moved on to the next thing, and being able to let go of that, that like you've worked so hard to finally figure this out. You found success. Now you have to let it go and learn a new thing. Like, it's like this never ending cycle.
But it's a very healthy life lesson because that's how life works, not just like on a professional level, but also on a personal level. You get older, some things no longer are possible. Other things are all of a sudden much easier than they were. So I'm really grateful for everything that music taught me, because of art in a wider sense, because a lot of life lessons, if you take a hard look at what you're doing, what you want to do, what you should be doing. These are like sometimes opposing forces at work, and you really need to understand, like, I have this limited time frame on this planet, maybe let's say 100 years if you're lucky. And then you also have to understand, you can't run a marathon anymore if you're 80. So you might want to do some things early in life and other things later in life. Once experience accumulates, you have much more patience and you're much more relaxed disposition when I've seen this a couple of times, it's going to work out. So I feel that, that's really something I learned also through my life in music.
Yeah, exactly. Those are super valuable lessons. And I think that's where experience almost trumps, any kind of like natural God-given talent that you might have.
Anytime, every time, 100%.
Yeah, we see that in Web3 a lot too, because I think Web3 is kind of similar right now in the sense that it's still so early and there's no playbook and no one really knows what they're doing with NFTs and with DAOs and all of this. So you really have to be open to experimenting and to try new things and to failing and to maybe succeeding, but then having to move on to the next thing. One thing I wanted to ask you about is like these distribution methods. So back in the 90s, when you first started, there was no YouTube, there was no Spotify. The only way really to get your name out there was to get signed to a label or to, I guess, go and play shows, right? And get seen by people in real life.
Yeah, even back then, DJ was like a complete separate kind of job description. DJs very rarely actually produced records. Many of the big players at that time, they were known for going to the record shop, getting all the latest imports, having access to promos, and then crafting a set around this. So they didn't have the time to produce records. What we see now is like a totally different job description, now it's more like these showcase sets where it's about putting yourself in front of the music and kind of making a name for yourself. So really back then, DJing was more like a way to be up to date, specifically the music I was known for, jungle, was, reinventing itself in really, really rapid cycles. So it was so important for me to be able to have access to the music and also this understanding like what is working and what doesn't. Because again, there was not like blueprints you could build on. You needed to have a kind of a basic understanding like how the music works. But on top of that, you really had to inject your personality and you had to come up with something new. Otherwise, you would not be accepted in that scene and you were not able to make a name for yourself. So I think that's very different also to today. Nowadays, you need to come with something that is fitting very much in specific boxes, right? And if you can add a tiny bit of personality, that's good, but please don't add too much to it. We want to understand what's going on here. And that was really for me like a totally different experience in the 90s, where it was like, really, who are you as an artist? Why should I buy your record instead of this person's record, right? In that sense, being a DJ really gave me that chance to kind of iterate in front of an audience. Like I would go out on a Friday, I would play a track. And back then you couldn't have like a CD player in the club. So what we would do is we would cut what's called a dub plate. This is actually something coming from the Jamaican sound system culture. And essentially you go to a cutting house where they also manufacture the first step of the mass produced vinyl, but you actually take that with you and you play it in the club. So it's very fragile. You can only play it 10, 20 times and it disintegrates. But this was giving me the chance to produce a track, go with a DAT, which is like a lossless magnetic tape that you could use as a master to cut from, and then go to the club with that dub plate, play it, gauge the reaction, go back, revise, So I got very early into the habit of building in public, This is something that now in the DAO age also really helps me, because what you mentioned earlier, this, rapid iteration, failing, and then learning through these experiences. This is something I first experienced as a DJ, playing my own music, realizing this totally falls flat. Nobody's into that. And then kind of doing something where I wasn't even so sure if this was even going to work, and then getting a massive response out of this, So this is an interesting parallel now that I talk about it.
Definitely. So I know we've spent a lot of time in the 90s, and it's, I think all the questions is mostly because I wasn't old enough back then to go to clubs or to really like have a say in what kind of music I wanted to listen to. So I was most interested in that. But let's sort of summarize the next couple of decades before we get to Web3. So the 2000s and the 2010s, sort of like looking back, how would you summarize those 2 decades into like various periods of time? My guess would be maybe one is when YouTube came around and could upload music online and get more distribution that way. Maybe another one is when social media really blew up and you could really kind of advertise and promote yourself and your own brand. But yeah, I'll let you give us a summary of that.
Sure. I think interesting is always that technology was driving a certain changes in the creative scene, or also like in how art is being consumed. It doesn't matter if it's music or movies or, obviously it's always driven by technology. So I still remember very well how it was to be able to send your first email. And I just found one very funny story related to this. Like when I was doing one of my major releases, I sent a label copy, basically the copyright information to the label. And back before that, you would actually send a fax. And I just had an email address. So I was really proud. And I sent the email to the product manager. And then after like a half a year, I was holding the record in my hands. And I realized also it was the first email they ever received. So they added, in addition to the copyright information, they also included on the record, get your free email from hotmail.com, which was always the standard footer that was always added whenever you were sending out a mail. So when I found this the other day, it really made me chuckle, like how far we've come.
Wow, Hotmail. That's a real throwback. I feel like Hotmail, like AOL, Yahoo Mail, those.
Yes.
You hardly see those email addresses anymore today.
Very rare, very rare. So at first when, like, let's say, Real Player was a thing before YouTube, because back then through the bandwidth, you were not able to play back high quality music, but you still had sites that was, for instance, collecting rare pieces of music or like upcoming releases, like Real Player snippets. So that was for me like the first kind of change, I would say, that people were starting to be aware of music, because before that everything was very local. Everybody who wanted to hear my music that was not yet released had to come to one of my shows. And now all of a sudden you were able to listen to these pieces of music also, like if you were in Australia, and the world just got much smaller through the means of being able to share recorded audio. And I think like there's the first disruption really was iTunes, when there was like, I remember like a really big discussion going on. Should you sell digital copies of your music? Should you only sell them on a physical format? Back then also this 99 cents, it's so cheap, So yeah, there was, I think, a big disruption that all of a sudden you could buy music from iTunes. And then there was also like a DJ related outlet called Beatport. So because back then also iTunes had like limited bandwidth in regards to the quality of the records. And then there was Beatport that offered quasi-lossless versions for the DJ. Obviously, if you're in a club, you want to have the full frequency recording. So that was, I think, the first clear sign that there was a transition happening from physical goods that were expensive to manufacture, expensive to store, to something that is available to anybody everywhere for a small fee. And I think in a certain way, it also democratized the whole system because, for instance, vinyl is obviously very elite. The whole vinyl discussion is very like classist, because there's territories like South America or East Asia where people cannot afford a vinyl record. First of all, you have the difference in buying power. Then you have all the costs involved in the transport. So in a way, I was also kind of happy to see that this was getting everybody on the same page. And then I would say, obviously, the next big disruptor, you mentioned social media. I think the first big paradigm shift was with MySpace, because you had the MySpace audio player. So I remember uploading snippets of tracks there and also, connecting to other artists through MySpace. And then you had this thing called the AOL Instant Messenger. This was really important, like in the 2000s, because if you knew somebody's handle, you could speak to them and then you could transfer files. Right. So this was a big thing back then. You could then say, hey, I heard this track. Can you send it to me? And then they would send you like a 300 kbps MP3 and you were able to put it on the CD and play it in the club. So AIM was really, really important as like a musical place where everybody could mingle and you would see like who's online, and you had all the different time zones, obviously. So just made everything much more democratic. And then the next thing that came obviously was streaming. When Spotify came along, that was, I think, for a lot of musicians a big shock, because they realized the sales from the downloads are dwindling, because if you're not a DJ, why bother downloading the music if you can just listen to on the go, And I think that's also like where a lot of artists got kind of disenchanted with constantly having to chase the technological advances and just to make a living. Yeah, I think looking back at the last few decades, those are really like the kind of crystallization points for me, where I realized, okay, something new is happening here. And that was usually also the moment, like when I got that whiff, okay, you have to have that instinct, almost like a hunting dog. Okay, now something is approaching, you have to be ready before everybody else. And you need to ask yourself these hard questions like, all right, what is it that I really want to do? What is it that I need to do, And sometimes these are opposites. And then you have to find out how to distribute your time evenly to not stretch yourself thin. And if you're lucky, they kind of point both to the same direction. But yeah, this is like the story of my life. And I think the more you kind of lean into it and the more you learn to love it, then also the easier it gets to accept that, as we mentioned earlier, life is constant evolution, and time moves in one direction, always forward. And you gotta roll with the punches. It's the only way to do it.
For sure. It's interesting because hearing you talk about that, it almost sounds like you look back onto the early internet days, what we, in the Web3 community now maybe label as Web 1, with AOL instant messaging, with the early days of iTunes. You talked about how that sort of helped democratize access to music for a lot of people who maybe couldn't afford these expensive vinyls. And then when you start talking about what we call Web 2, which is sort of the rise of social media and streaming and things like this, I think I heard less positive, like looking back with fondness. Am I just reading too much into it, or is there something there that you would agree with?
It's totally accurate. And I think it's even something that I see as an extension where we are now in Web 3, because like based on my experience in the Web 1 days, I could really focus on my core passion, being creative, being in a studio. It's like a muscle. If I don't spend here every day and a few hours, working on productions, but also experimenting, this is really like where I can grow as an artist. So that's why I feel like the Web 1 days, it was much more kind of, the production line was much more focused on, okay, you need to have like something really, really valuable and really good. And then you have other people other parties that, take care of getting it to the audience. And the audience was, reading a magazine and reading for a review, and somebody wrote a good review saying this is cutting edge, this is like a paradigm shift, and people would go out and listen to the record, and if they like it, they bought it, Whereas in the like Web 2 days, when we talk about even the dawn of social media, I started to realize, hold on, I now have a whole new job to do. And this eats into what is actually my core self, this artist inside of me that wants to express and kind of, develop. That's really the most important feeling for me, to not stand still. And then I realized, hold on, now of these 10 hours I can spend in the studio, I need to like devote an hour to, writing something on MySpace or, and now if we look at it, it's completely upside down, where it's just, I see people who spend all their time talking about their releases and their drops and so on. And I just don't see how, you still need to sleep, you still need to do your laundry and cook something. And, if you kind of then break it down, how many hours are really left to work on what I consider the most important thing, finding your authentic expression, finding your authentic self, and then constantly reevaluating if this is who I still am. The time left for this, if I now factor in all these other aspects of being an artist in Web 3, this is really maybe where you sense that change in my tone.
Yeah, so let's get into that. I think one of the biggest things that people talk about with Web3 and how that affects creators is this concept of, like, Legion wrote about it, the 100 true fans that comes from, the 1,000 true fans, where it's like you don't need that mass distribution that people work so hard for in Web 2. Web 2, it was like if you didn't have 1 million subscribers on YouTube, then like what even is the point? You're not making anything. With Web3, it's like with NFTs, you can have 100 true fans and make a living from something like that. Has that been your experience since coming into the Web3 space, or has it been a little different from that?
Yeah, I think it's a nice theory, the concepts you talked about, maybe next we at the 10 true fans, let's see that number diminish more and more and the prices go up. But yeah, I think it's important to also be honest, about artists entering the Web3 world and kind of telling that story that you can make a living through just a very limited group of supporters. I think we have to understand that the amount of people who are actually buying NFTs, it's really small. And like fans of music who want to buy NFTs is even smaller. So I think that deciding factor that I mentioned earlier, like where I kind of see my value as an artist, continuously growing and always finding new ways to express myself. This was something very valuable. This was my capital in a way when I was releasing records. And now I find myself in a world where this is very different, where a lot of people, you can even read it in interviews with collectors, or like it's a sentiment you find often on Twitter where people say, I don't even listen to the music that I buy as a music NFT. And obviously this is, I feel, catering towards a different type of artist. If you have that kind of energy within yourself to constantly be on spaces and to constantly be present in that scene, I feel like you have a much better chance to also sell your NFTs. Whereas if you try to really come up with something that's based around the music and where you pour all your heart and soul into that and then don't talk so much about it, there's far less chance of success based on my experience. And so in that sense, I feel like, I'm really excited about the technology. I'm always interested, to understand every type of new technology. As I said earlier, coming from the days of a rotating vinyl disc and then to a CD where a laser was reading the zeros and ones to where we are right now. I'm always constantly learning and studying, like, how could I use this in a creative way? And, for me, this is also like one of the reasons why I got into building, and exhibiting in museums, building these audio installations, because I realized, just technology inspires me to find ways to express myself. And that's also the reason why I was really excited about first learning about blockchain technology and understanding, oh, hold on, I could actually do this. I could do a unique copy of a digital file and I could have these attributes, that are specific to this one edition. So I'm still super excited about this. But coming back to your question, I just feel like we are in a market where the number of collectors is limited, and also like the reason for collectors to buy a music NFT, I think is not, in most cases, is not based around like this amazing cutting edge music. And I want to give this artist a chance to continue to work on his craft and, build it out into something amazing. I feel like there's just other forces at play, and that's just how it is. I'm not saying that's horrible. I'm just saying, I have to find my pocket within that ecosystem.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Based on my observations of artists in the space too, it seems like it hasn't really changed that much from the Web 2 stuff that you were talking about, with how artists have to spend so much more time promoting themselves, like writing social media posts, talking about what they're doing, instead of actually focusing on creating the stuff that they want to create. I've honestly have not seen much of a shift in the Web3 space just yet for not just, musical artists, but for artists and creators in general. I still see the people that succeed the most are constantly holding Twitter spaces, are constantly on social media talking about what they're doing, going on podcasts, doing all of these things, which are not like the core work that they've set out to do. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what the future looks like for Web3 music, because I know you're always looking ahead to future trends, thinking about how you can kind of jumpstart your path and your strategy for making a living as a musician that way. So looking ahead, like this is the state we're in now. We're still early, I think is an accurate summary. But looking ahead to the next few years, where do you see this landscape shifting? And then can you kind of explain it in a way that mainstream people can understand today? Because I think a lot of people think, well, why would I buy your NFT when I can still stream your music on Spotify for free? I think that's kind of a common piece of feedback I get. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the future of Web3 looks like.
And I think it's also a good question, right? I feel like a lot of the ideas and concepts that are being talked about in Web3, it's this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? People just hope that it becomes true the longer you talk about it. But often when you're confronted by somebody from the outside who's asking, why the hell would I do this? What's the benefit for me? And I think it's a really good way to test the hypothesis by just speaking to somebody who's agnostic or who doesn't understand really what's happening there. So in that sense, I'm still very much on the fence on this whole concept of saying it's like a digital file and you pay a premium, but through this I get a more stable income. I think that's, if we would really be honest, that's how a lot of this works at the moment. You hear a lot of building a community, but I also often ask other players in the space, what do you actually think it means to build a community? So my first experience with music NFT, or my very first release was actually a generative piece where I wrote code that would generate, I called it this aleatoric music box. So it was, depending on your edition, how you minted it, different parameters would basically result in different choices in how this thing was tuned, how the speed of the individual playheads was. So this was something I felt like, wow, that's just so amazing. It's something you just leave in the back, on one of the tabs of your browsers running while you write your essays or, So for me, I'm really interested to create music these days that has a specific purpose, and especially when I'm very much into ambient music and music that provides a kind of setting for you to almost like self-medication. If I put this music on, it does this to me, right? In a positive way. So that's why I feel to be very experimental in that regard, that you also, make use of that infrastructure that we now have with the blockchain to have music that is not okay, here's a pop song and I'm going to upload it to IPFS and then you mint it and you get a certificate that you own it. I feel like that's the current status quo, but I don't really see that as this paradigm shift that the technology actually could, in theory, enable us. So I'm just having all these ideas. What could be if you could choose to mint a song that is just made for you, right? So you have your own taste in music, or you have your own kind of emotions and your own preferences. So I could provide you with controls to kind of adapt it to your liking in a way where it's still my creation, but you're kind of co-creating it, right? This is something I'm really excited about. And it's, in some ways, it's still a bit arbitrary maybe for the collector, for instance, I did this project together with the Forefront DAO when I was their artist in residency. And again, it's a generative piece, which kind of builds on this idea of these flocks of birds, right? So you have what's called a murmuration. So you have these particles that move in a three-dimensional space, and this motion is then translated into sound. So you got all these kind of soundscapes coming out of it. And this was really inspiring for me to try to find out more, how can I give the collector more control to really make it a collaborative effort? This is something I'm really excited about.
That's super cool. It just reminded me when you said aleatoric. Have you spoken with Matt Condon, one of the many Matts? By chance, he started a project that he calls aleatoric, and it's basically he records himself in his sleep, and he takes any files where he's sleep talking, and oftentimes it's just gibberish. It's not any real words or anything, and he puts that into a track, and he has a visual artist create some, visual artwork that goes along with that track. But
that's so cool.
Yeah, you should chat with him. He and Jonathan Mann, his good friend, actually have a podcast together called Digitally Rare, where they talk all about NFTs, and they've had a bunch of generative artists on too that I think you would be really
Amazing.
interested
Yeah,
in speaking with.
I would love to have a chat if you could get me in touch.
Sure. Yeah, I would love to. So to sort of wrap this up, I guess, what are your best tips for a musician or any kind of artist who's just trying to get into the Web3 space and trying to understand how they can use the tools of Web3 to better distribute and monetize their artwork or their music or their content?
Right. So I would say the first thing is really understand how blockchain technology works. So I would say really figure out how to read a contract, use one of the tools where you like a block explorer or whatever, where you can then, disseminate all the different fields and really understand the kind of concept, what it actually means to mint your work. It's easier said than done, but I feel like that knowledge goes a long way, because having this understanding then also enables you to, abstract every new kind of technology that enters the space in regards to that underlying core mechanism. So I was really lucky. There was one of the devs working on the Mint Songs project. His handle is Sweetman. He really took like an hour and he sat down with me and he explained, like, I wanted to have kind of like a custom contract and then publish this on Zora. And he just talked me through the whole process. Okay, with Open Zeppelin, or I think that's what it's called, to kind of, these are the parameters you need to query and then what comes back. So it was, I really appreciate that hour I invested, but that was kind of like what gave me my core understanding of all the different ways how to mint and to deploy. And so I would say that's super important to have that kind of knowledge. It's like if you want to drive a car, you need to get a license, right? So I feel like if you want to publish in Web3, you need to also understand what it is that you're actually doing, and you need to understand how you can retrieve your file, how you can copy your files from IPFS, how to find a location, see who's minted it, so that really, really helped me a lot and also gave me a lot of ideas. So that would be my first suggestion. And the second suggestion is like, find your tribe, find the people that are on a similar path. And I've done it many times, just kind of cold message somebody on Twitter saying, hey, I really like what you do. You want to jump on the call and just have like a conversation, and I feel like we really have to find these moments to really sit down, do long form, as cool as it is to be on a space, it's always like very, there's only so much like depth you can reach. And that's why I feel like understand who you are. Maybe that's my tip number 3. Understand who you are and how you operate. Like, what is it that you can really do authentically? If you're not the kind of person that has this upbeat personality and that voice to really come across as like somebody who should speak on the space, then you don't have to. Then you have to find another way to get your point across. So, I think authenticity is the key. And if you try to emulate somebody, if you try to be somebody you're not, you're going to have a miserable time and you're not going to be able to convince anybody. So I think with these 3, not talking about specific platforms or growth strategies and so on, I feel like get that out of the way first and really do your homework, find people that are on a similar path and, join forces and support each other and really understand what it is that you want to achieve. Like, what are you in for? If it's just the money, then that's one way to do it. If it's just for the art, it's another way to do it. And if you someone want to combine it, that's a third path you could choose. And yeah, I think it's just, you should always be really excited about what you do, because otherwise you're just wasting your time and you're wasting your life. And that's the most precious thing. Time is the only resource that never increases, only decreases. So we better make our best use out of it.
What an inspirational close. Wow. And just to echo those first 2 points too, I will say that people in the space are extremely willing to help. And they get extremely excited when they see somebody new enter the space and want to learn. So like what you were saying about reaching out to Zora for help reading contracts, or even cold DMing artists you like on Twitter. Like, these are things that I have myself done many, many times as well, and pretty much have, a very high success rate with. I've found that works really well because as long as you approach it in the right way, you know, like I've gotten a lot of cold DMs that aren't so nice, or it's just like very demanding and, you know,
Yes.
not the kind of message that like you would want to really respond to from somebody you don't know. But if you send somebody a DM that's genuine, that is respectful, that is kind, and you just ask for 15 minutes of their time just to kind of connect and chat and hang out, like I think most people would be more than happy to give you the time of day.
100%. Yeah, I think what you said is really important to understand also like time, how valuable it is. So if you ask somebody if they want to have a chat with you, it also means, you know, they offer their most valuable resource to you. So as you said, you know, you need to also be somehow compelling and maybe just show that you're a nice person and genuinely interested in the person you want to talk to. And it's not just like a one-way transaction. Because as you said, we all get these messages so often like, hey, I'm launching a new project. Can I pick your brains? Or like, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that? That's not the way to do it. You know, that's not how you would approach somebody on the street or like in your apartment block. You wouldn't knock at the door, say, hey, give me like a liter of milk or whatever. You know, there's like a certain decorum around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. All right. So, Kabuki, we end every podcast with a fun little game. It's a rapid fire word association game. So basically, I have 10 words here. They're mostly words that are overused or often misused in Web3. And so I'm going to say a word and you say the first word that comes to your head. Okay.
Wow. All right.
There's the only rule is you can't think about it. You got to say the first thing that comes to your head and you can't say the same thing I just said. That's it. Anything else is fair game. It doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to, no other rules, no other parameters beyond that.
All right.
Okay.
I give it a shot.
Okay, cool. So first one, community,
Friendship,
privacy,
safe space,
DAO,
community,
tokenization,
limited edition,
ownership,
a thrift store,
exclusivity,
one-on-one,
protocol,
principles,
scarcity,
peak oil,
governance,
community,
and then last one, identity.
your true self.
Okay, I think you said community a couple times in there.
Yes.
But that just means community is top of mind. Community is a huge thing I'm sure every creator thinks about, so that makes a lot of sense. Last thing, Kabuki, before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to follow you on socials or if they want to listen to your music. Go ahead and plug away at all of the things.
So I think the easiest way to kind of find out what I'm up to is check out my site. It's www.iamkabuki.xyz. And this basically takes you to all my socials and to my different kind of YouTube channel and Spotify profile and so on. So I always try to make sure like my latest work is up top, and there's like a little kind of profile video as well that also is like a little introduction maybe to my personal philosophy if anybody cares to check this out. So I feel like that's the one-stop resource.
Perfect. We will include all of that in the show notes, pull out some of those links to make it easy for listeners to find as well. Thank you so much, Kabuki, for taking the time to come on the podcast today. Thank you, listeners, for listening. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe. It helps us a lot. And we will be back again next Thursday with another episode of Rehash.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted by Diana Chen, produced and edited by Ellie Dots and Tyler Internet, and sponsored by Lens, Empire Wallet, and NFT.storage. Rehash is also supported by Rehash DAO, a community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes a part of Rehash DAO and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. Voting rights are reserved for our guests, sponsors, and OG crowdfund supporters. And to learn more about how to become a guest or sponsor, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Lens at rehash.lens.